Hello. Welcome to Bouncing Off the Walls Resin Art Studio. I'm Christina Vanderwater. Today is the very first tutorial of painting in layers with resin. Now, why do we want to do that? Because it creates some amazing three-dimensional looks. We are going to start with something simple, these daisies. And the reason we're starting simple is because it's going to take a little bit to get used to how the layers work. And you really have to kind of shift your brain a little to wrap it around how the depth works when you're doing layers of paint, layers of resin, and it also requires a ton of patience because each layer is another day. You have to let the layers cure in between. So this tutorial specifically can take up to 6 days if you're following along. Obviously, you can just watch the whole thing. It's not a 6-day tutorial. And then when you do it, keep that in mind that it is an art that requires a lot of patience, but hopefully you will see why that patience is worth it. So let's go make some daisies.
For this tutorial, I'm going to use two different options to create on. One a wooden coaster and one a coaster mold. You can choose whatever you like. For the wooden coaster, I'm going to use acrylic paint. I'm just going to paint a black base coat on there. I'm using black because it's going to show the artwork fairly well and make my flower stand out. You can do any color you wish, and it doesn't even have to be a solid color. So whatever color you want your background behind your flower to be, you go ahead and do that. For the one that's going to be made in the mold, I am going to do the resin in a black paste. Now I'm choosing black paste so that I don't have any sparkle or sheen to it. I want a nice solid black, but again, if you want a different color, if you want something that looks marbly, whatever, you go right ahead, pick whatever colors you want. The first step in this is basically just deciding what color our background is going to be. As I mentioned earlier, this process requires a lot of patience because we can literally only do one step a day. And the first part's a little boring. We're just doing the background. So we are going to do black on here, black in here, and the one coat of resin, and that's going to be it for today because we have to wait for that layer to cure before we can do our next one. So you want to make sure that for this entire project, if you're using paint for the background and the paint that we are going to be using for the flower is going to be acrylic paint, you don't want to use an oil paint because it does not blend with the resin very well at all. The resin is going to resist the oil in the paint. So you want to do a water-based acrylic paint. I'm just using a regular artist acrylic, and any black or any acrylic paint will do. So I'm just going with a solid black color. I'm looking for that like bright flower that's going to pop against a dark background, almost like if you were doing some sort of photography of flowers. I want to be able to show off all of the steps. So I'm doing black so it stands out really well, but as I mentioned, you can do any color you want. So once this is covered in paint, we need to let it dry. And while this dries, I'm going to mix our resin. I am going to do a solid black that's going in here, and I will just coat this one in clear because we have the black here. Now you're probably wondering why we don't just pour black on both. It is because we want to seal the wood in so that we don't get a lot of air coming out of that. So I just paint the wood black. That way it's sealed and I can just throw clear on there. It saves some steps when you're doing wood. I usually work with wood and not in the molds. So for this tutorial, I'm showing both, wood being my preference usually. When we are working with a lot of layers with paint in between our resin, it's obviously going to get thick, but you don't want each layer to be super thick. In a coaster mold like this, you only have so much space to go, but our first 2 layers are going to be built in here, and then we can take it out of the mold and it will be the same as what we're doing here. So don't worry if your resin layer starts to be too thick for this because we'll be taking it out of the mold anyway. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to just get clear on top because we've already painted it black. So I'm just going to do a light layer of clear on there, and then we are going to, I'm going to color the remaining resin black. And this one is going to get a layer of black, and you only just need enough to fill the bottom. We aren't trying to go right to the top of this mold. We're building our base to start our painting on. And with this one, I'm just going to smooth out the clear. I do make sure to run the resin around the edges because we are going to be doing multiple layers of resin. The edges are going to get a lot thicker as we go, so we want to make sure that they are smooth as well. I'm just going to take a torch to get rid of some of those bubbles. I don't use a torch on my molds. I don't want to wreck my molds, and the heat can do that. You can use a quick blast of the heat gun, I find, or if you want to put some rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle, a little spritz will help get rid of those bubbles. And now we let this cure. I told you the very first step was going to be a little bit boring, but it's going to get more fun from here on out. We're going to let these guys clear, and then we're going to start our painting tomorrow. We are now day 2, and we have our cured piece in the mold and our cured piece on the wood. Today we are going to do our first layer of paint on each of these. I'm going to do the same thing on both. I am sticking to a basic daisy, so I'll just be using daisy colors, but you can use whatever colors you like. You don't have to do a daisy. The reason I'm choosing a daisy is because it's a fairly simple one if you are just starting out or you've never done this kind of art before. It's an easy one to follow along with and still look really nice. Today we are going to be doing just the first layer of petals, which would be what you would see in the background. So if you were looking at the flower, we are going to do anything that's furthest away from us. When you're working with layers with resin, you start from the back and come forward. The more complicated the images get that you want to paint, the harder it can be to kind of wrap your brain around how you want to paint it and what goes down first. I always think if you had a flower like this, say, you're going to be looking at it like in slices. If someone were to take this and slice it, slice here, slice there, just in a bunch of slices, which slice are we painting first? So if we sliced it from the back, we're going to paint all the back stuff first. I know this is not a daisy, it's just a fake flower that I had. And you know, I've painted ones like this as well. It starts to get a little trickier for the brain, the harder the subject matter is, but if you can just start imagining everything in slices, we would start with our back pieces, and that's all we're going to paint today is the back pieces. I'm going to use some white, and I'm going to use this sort of a French blue just to have some shadow in there, a little tone to my flowers. Now you'll find when you are painting with acrylic onto resin, it's a little bit like painting on glass. So sometimes the first coat is a little transparent. You can see your brush strokes. Oftentimes you end up having to do 2 coats. It's going to depend on the colors, how you put your paint down, and the look that you're going for. So I am going to try and fit all of these on here so I can show you how I load my paintbrush. So for something as simple as daisies, I pretty much dip in my white. I do a little bit in that blue color, just enough to get some on there. Now our back pieces are going to be the darkest because they are behind the petals in front of them, and they're going to have a little bit more shadow from the petals in front of them. Now when we work with resin this way, we are going to be putting another layer of resin over our first layer of paint. It's actually going to create that barrier that gives us a real shadow. So even if you don't get your shadowing down for the painting part, our layers of resin in between everything is going to give us real shadows, which is super hard to show on film. Even when I take photos of my artwork like that, it's really hard to see the real true 3D effects of it, but you will see when you start doing it how that actually comes to fruition in real life. So let's start painting. I'm going to keep this pretty basic. Center is going to be the center of our flower. I'm not going to make it, you know, going sideways or any bent leaves, or sorry, bent petals. We're just going to keep it basic, just so that we can get the concept of layering with paint. And you may paint differently than me. You can do a different flower. I like to go fairly thick because I hate doing a second coat. Now, I'm not going to do a full thing of petals all the way around because our next layer is going to fill in some of those blanks. And also with flowers, they're not perfect, so I don't want this to be perfect either. Paint them how you wish. If you think something's too dark, you can come over it again. And if you mess this up and you're not happy with what's turning out here, you can just wash it off. I really only needed to dip into that French blue like one time, and it's kind of on my brush now for good, so I'm not going to worry about too much of that shadow. And I'm not worrying about the center of this flower yet, because we're going to do that after we get all the petals done. I feel like this one's a little bit darker than I like, so I'm just going to come back in a bit. As I said, it's okay if these aren't even, if we've skipped some spaces, because our next layer, we are going to come in and fill in some more. And I may have even been a little bit off center, but that's the fun thing about art. Next layer, I could come in. Now, if you had wanted to paint a stem as well, this would be a good time to paint a stem in so that it's at the back as well. And we're going to do the exact same thing on the one that is in the mold, but this will be our last day of keeping this one in the mold. The mold is a good option if you don't have a base to build something on. So these could be coasters. They can just be little art pieces, magnets, whatever. But if you don't have a wooden base or a ceramic base, then using a mold is a really good way to give you a base. Now you can see mine got a little transparent in the center. That is okay. Our flower's going to go there. And sometimes that transparency just gives it a little bit of extra depth anyway. So we're going to do the exact same thing on this one. In case you're wondering, my paintbrush is a #1 paintbrush. I couldn't even tell you the brand. I go through a lot of paintbrushes, and because I'm painting on wood a lot, I don't spend a lot of money and buy really expensive ones because I end up ruining them. And I'm really bad at leaving them in the paint water anyway. So I find that if I buy cheaper ones, they do the job too, and then I'm not wrecking expensive stuff. These were, I believe I bought them on Amazon in a package. Okay, there is our 2 flowers. I know they don't look like much right now, but that's what we are going to do, is build up. Next step is to let this thoroughly dry. You need your paint to be dry before you put your next layer of resin on, or you're going to end up with the paint blending into the resin and you're going to wreck all your artwork. So we're going to let these dry, and then we are just going to be mixing some clear resin. That's all we need today is clear, and then we have to wait another day. Now that our paint is dry, we are going to put our next layer of resin on here. So for your wooden one, if you're doing a wooden one, or a tile, for your one that's not in the mold, you're going to want to make sure that you have it raised up so that the resin runs off. And for the mold one, this will be our last resin layer in the mold. And so you can just fill this one right to the top. If it's a thin mold like this, if it's thicker, you don't want to go too deep with each layer of clear, because if you do, it's going to look, the artwork look really disjointed. So what we are going for in between our layers of paint and resin is just a thin coat, just enough to create a little bit of depth. You won't be able to go too thick on something that's not in a mold anyway, because the resin will run off. But if you're working in a mold and it's thicker than this one, and by thicker I mean deeper, then you want to make sure that your next layer is still thin. So clear layer, and then that is going to get spread out on there. However you like to spread your resin. We'll do a quick zap to get rid of the bubbles and let this cure for one more day. All right, day 3. Our second layers are cured. Today we are going to take this one out of the mold. There's no room left in our mold. If you do have room, if you have a deeper mold and you want to do the next layer in a mold as well, you can. But eventually you're going to need to take it out anyway. So we're going to take this one out, and because we will be doing resin on this and we now have a backside, we want to prep the back for drip removal. Now you might have your own way of doing this. You can use liquid latex on the back. I am actually going to just do a layer of Minwax finishing paste. It works great. It makes it so you can just take those drips off. So I am going to do that, and then we are going to get to today's painting. I like the Minwax because it's really easy. A little bit goes a long way, and I don't have to wait for it to dry, and it makes it so the drips come off super easy. I coat the whole bottom with a coaster because sometimes when you're handling them, you'll get resin right into the middle. So this just keeps it easy, makes it so I can remove the drips wherever they are. For your coaster that has been in the mold, you might have a sharp lip around the edges. Now we're going to be doing more layers of resin, so if it's not a really high lip, then it's not a big deal. But if it's too high up and too sharp, then the next layer of resin will not really cover it completely. So you can use a deburring tool and you can just go around and take off that sharp edge. If you are not comfortable with a deburring tool, which I know a lot of people aren't, I do actually have a video showing how to use it, but you can also just sand that edge down to make it a little bit more even, a little softer, so that the next layer of resin will go over smoothly. I like the deburring tool because it's a little neater. When you sand the resin, you end up with a lot of resin dust, and then you have to make sure everything's cleaned up. So deburring tool takes off that little sharp edge, and we're ready to go for paint. So our painting today is going to be pretty much exactly the same as yesterday. I'm probably going to do a little bit less of the gray-blue color that's in there, only because we're getting a little closer to our viewer and our light. But essentially the same thing. Now, when you start to paint the petals this time, you don't want to just cover up the bottom ones. You do want to overlap them for sure. This is kind of our back and our bottom layer. I don't like to just go completely perfect in between each one. If you look at an actual daisy or a flower with petals like this, the petals aren't as perfect as you might think. So I just kind of do the same thing again, overlapping our first layer in the exact same way that we did before. Now, I don't know if you can tell, it's really hard to show this on video, but because we've got that layer of resin between our first petal paint and this one, it starts to create its own 3D look. So you do have a little bit of space between those petals, and you will get real shadows which occur. This is how we build our three-dimensional look. Now you can get into doing this really, really finicky and over a lot of days' time. If, for instance, because this petal is coming over that one, you want to not do this one in the second layer, but the third one. But we don't need this tutorial to go on and on for weeks. So we are just going to keep it a little simpler. The amount of 3D look that you get is really going to depend on you and how many days of painting that you want and how much you want to do for each layer. I've done some really complicated sea turtles where one day of painting is literally just a couple of brush strokes here and there just to add a depth for one thing, and then another layer of resin. So it's really up to you how many layers you want to do for how three-dimensional you want to make it. And if you are following along at home, you will see that this looks more 3D in person than it does on video. It's been one of the hardest things, is to really truly show the effect of these in photos or videos, because it just doesn't pick it up the same as your eyes can. So I'm going to leave that there. You can see that that 3D look is already starting. And we're going to do the same thing on the second one. These two are basically the same now. Just this one has the wooden base and this one is all made from resin in a mold. So it just depends on what you have for supplies and what you're building your artwork on. So you can see as you do these, the 3D effect really starts to come together, and we aren't done yet. As I said, patient process. It's best to do a whole bunch at once. That way you're not just doing one coaster that's taking you a week, but it is time consuming. It does require patience, but in the end, the effect is awesome. So once this paint dries, we're doing that third coat of resin. This time, because we have taken this one out of the mold, it's going to need something to sit up on a standoff of some kind as well. And we're just going to clear coat these again. I've got a lot of micro bubbles in this mix of resin. Part of that is the way I mixed it. The other part of that is that we have the air conditioning on in our house right now because it's really hot here and it's probably a little chilly down in my basement studio. So I'm not too concerned about bubbles though. I use a decent resin so they work themselves out and I use my heat on them. So even though this looks super bubbly, it's going to come out clear. Little torch. Now, if you don't get all the micro bubbles out with your torch right away, just let it sit for a couple of minutes and come back again and do it some more. They do work themselves out while it sits here, so you can definitely get rid of all of them. And that is day 3. We're going to let this cure, and another layer of paint will be coming up tomorrow. Day 4, here we go. Here are our cured pieces from yesterday, and today we are going to do a few more petals and start the inside part. So I am going to use the same colors that we were using yesterday for those petals. Probably a little bit more leaning towards the white than that gray blue color, just to get, you know, a little bit of color variation. As we come upward, the light is a little brighter. Now you could do a full another set of petals if you wanted. I'm going to do a few shorter ones. The flower is yours. You can play with it. It doesn't have to be realistic. It can be an abstract flower, whatever you would like to do. So both of these are going to get the same treatment, and we're just going to do a couple more petals. I'm going to go a little shorter, I think. Same idea, same thing we've been doing. You can see as soon as I paint that on there, you can really see the 3D now between the first layer, the second layer, and now the third. And no, today will not be our last day because we want that centerpiece to pop as well. Now, if you've done like me and you brought your flowers right into the center, we want to let this dry before we start in on our yellow color. I'm going to use yellow. You don't have to use yellow, so that it doesn't blend and mix with the white and come out funny. So we'll let these dry a minute and then we will get going on the middle part. For this next part, I'm going to not get into a bright yellow yet. We're going to use those for more of the highlighted areas that are closer to us. I'm going to use a milk chocolate and this sort of golden marigold color. And there's a couple of ways that you can do the middle part. You can use a little sponge type brush like this. And sorry, my paint palette's got lots of colors on it, but these are the two right here that we're using. You can just sort of dab in both those colors get kind of a mottled look on the bottom there, and just sort of dab that on. Now it's an easy way to get some varying colors. We're going to build on top of this in another layer, so that's sort of just our background dark deep in areas, if that makes sense. If you don't have a sponge or you don't want to use a sponge, you can use a regular paintbrush and basically just do the same sort of thing. Just dabbing it on. Whoop, I just dripped some paint or splattered some paint elsewhere, so I'll have to touch that up with some white in a minute. But I don't like this to be perfectly round because they aren't perfectly round in an actual flower. Another thing you can do to get into the details a little bit more on this layer as we're getting closer to the top is you can get into the darker gray color and you can get in there hand painting things a little more specifically with shadows and such. The painting part's going to be up to you. But to keep it simple, we'll leave these like this. We're gonna let this dry and do our next layer of resin again. I'm gonna touch up my little splatters that I put there, and then another clear coat and another day. And number 4 layer of resin, the exact same as we've done for the other ones. Okay, so that is our 4th layer. We are still going to do one more. You can see why this is a patient art. I have done some things that have had as many as 16 layers. The artwork you do and how detailed you want to make it is going to be the deciding factor in how many layers you end up doing. As I mentioned, we're going to keep it fairly simple by just doing a basic flower. We're not getting too detailed with the design, just to show you how the layers work, how you get the 3D look. And tomorrow, once this cures, we are going to work a little bit more into here, and it's just going to bring it up just a little bit closer, and you will definitely see how that 3D effect starts to take place. All right, what day are we on? Day 5, right? Day 5. So we have 4 layers of resin and paint on these, and you can see how the 3D effect is starting to take place. I'm going to try and show you these in the sun at some point, or with a brighter light. We actually have rain right now, so I can't show you in the sun, but you will see how the shadows actually form and make it look 3-dimensional. Today we are going to just finish up the details in the middle of the flowers here. I'm going to show you some optional steps just to add a few little extra details to make it look a little bit more 3D, and should be our final for this. You can do more than 6 layers if you want to get really detailed with each petal, each step. You want to make the middle part come up even more. You can do 7, 8 layers. The choice is yours. It's just going to be a matter of if you feel it's done or not. So we're gonna keep it simple and stick with 6 because you guys don't want to be here forever with me. Today I am going to keep my same 2 colors that I used yesterday, and we're going to add a bright yellow in there as well. And I'm also going to use some white because we will be doing a few little details of highlights. But for today, these are the 3 colors that will be our main focus. Okay, today I'm going to do the milk chocolate. I'm gonna dip a little in there, dip a little in my marigold color, and going to dip in that bright yellow. It's just the way I paint. You don't have to do it this way. And I'm just going to come in a bit from the edges and sort of build up almost like little dots. Just build up that center of the flower. I'm going to do this on both of them. And something I like to do just to add a little highlights, I sometimes will come in with a little brush and I'll look at some of the petals and I'll just add just a little bit of white. And it's amazing once you get the resin on here how this can add a little bit of depth just by adding some little highlights. And I'm going to add a few little highlights in the flower. So if you really want to go for super 3D, you can do this another layer of resin and then come in and do even more highlights a little bit more, and it's going to make this center look quite rounded. Sometimes I find when my petals don't have a lot of variation is when I really like to come through and just do a little bit extra. You can even paint extra petals again. Every little bit you do is just building up the dimension. And some of it can be really subtle, but it really adds to the piece. I'm going to leave that one as is and do the other one. This is the one that we used a sponge on. I'm not going to use a sponge, or maybe I should use a sponge for this, just in case you are using a sponge and not a paintbrush. Going to use a little bit of a smaller one this time, and I am going to dab in those same colors, probably just a little bit of the brown, just enough. I don't usually paint with a sponge, so this is new for me as well. But we can just dab right on the top. And you don't have to cover the whole piece because the dark first layer is going to look further back. There's going to be depth to this. It's, like, as I've mentioned, really hard to show in a video, but because we have resin in between these layers, it really brings this layer up. And then if you want to add just a little bit of white highlight in there, I just dipped a tiny corner on there, and you can just dab that on as well. If you really want to get artistic, this is a cool time to add even a little ladybug. That would require a few more layers if you want to make that ladybug look three-dimensional. I'm going to also add a few more things to these petals. Our final details step. Think about adding the highlights to the things that are forefront, like right on top. So this petal technically comes over that petal a little. You might have a little highlight where the light hits this petal. You can just do a very light, almost like a watercolor sort of highlight of the paint. So it doesn't have to cover the whole bottom part. It can just be a really light. You can see I've got hardly any paint on there, just enough to do some highlights. Paint the flower how you wish. I'm not a fan of how this area looks, so I'm going to come in with a little bit of my brown and just sort of cover that up. And I also think that this one could use a little bit more of the bright yellow in there. Just some little dots right in the center. So there's our two daisies. Today's going to be their final coat of resin if you're stopping at this point, or you might be wanting to continue on and do more petals, more work in the centerpieces. The choice is yours, but let's get that final coat of resin on. Last layer of resin. You may want to cover your project with something just to keep any dust or lint out while it cures. Since it's our final coat, we don't want any nasties in there. And that is it for the resin part. If it's your last layer, or you might be continuing on to do more. That is entirely up to you. Once these cure, I'm going to show them off in a different lighting so you can see all the dimension that was created by working in layers this way. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you experiment with some other ideas aside from just a flower. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate the support. These are all cured now, and you can actually see in this very dramatic light. I turned the lights off in my studio here, and it's just the light coming in through the window, but that really creates shadows, so you can definitely see how that 3D effect takes place with the way the light is shining on these now, especially that last sort of little strokes that I did on the white, on the petals. And you can see how the real shadows show up the way the light hits. So that was the one on wood, and here's our one that we did in the mold. And you can definitely get creative with these. Flowers are just a more simple way to get practiced and get started.